Yes, sir. You're good.
Perfect. Okay. Sounds good. Well, yeah, thanks for the invitation to give a research update tonight. And I'll share some data here, and hopefully the math isn't too complicated. And if you have any questions, we'll answer those at the end, but certainly don't hesitate to ask. Some of this stuff can be a little bit confusing in the way it's presented. I want to make sure everyone's clear on how we're expressing these metrics of feed efficiency and how we need to interpret them and understand what they really mean. So we think about feed efficiency, how we quantify it, and how we go about improving that trait and selecting for that trait. I want to start off with a few definitions here that we'll reference throughout the talk. So intake, pretty straightforward. Simply how much feed is consumed by an individual every day. That's where it has to start. We take that intake number and then we compare that to relative levels of performance, and we can start to get an idea on how well that animal is converting what they eat to actual, production, whether it be weight gain, milk production, whatever it might be. So it starts with intake. Getting intake is much more difficult than it might seem at surface level. Measuring individual animal intake on a large set of animals that are group housed becomes a challenge and requires equipment that's relatively expensive. And I'll show you what that system looks like here in just a little bit. So the pro to intake, measuring intake is, obviously it's what they actually ate. But if we just single trait select for those animals that have low intake, that aren't eating as much every day, more often than not, we will just end up with animals that aren't performing. They don't eat because they don't do anything else. And so we can't simply use intake alone as a selection metric without referencing that to some other production characteristic. And so that brings us to what we call feed to gain ratio. This is a really common form that feed efficiency is expressed in. It's simply how much feed is required for that animal to gain 1 pound of body weight. It's really efficiency in its simplest form. Who gains the same amount while consuming less feed to do so. And so it's great from that standpoint, especially as a feedlot metric. It makes some sense which animals use less feed to gain that body weight during that growth phase of production. The challenge becomes that the bottom side of that feed to gain ratio metric is gain, average daily gain. And we know that if we select animals that have very high average daily gains, we will end up with large mature sizes. Those traits are highly related. And so when we select for feed to gain, if we're not careful, we will ultimately select for animals that just simply grow faster. And if we select for animals that grow faster, we're going to end up with larger framed animals. And we know that larger framed animals have higher maintenance requirements, are going to require more nutrients just to sustain themselves every day, are going to be potentially harder doing and harder keeping, which is the exact opposite of what we're trying to do with breeding and selecting for a feed efficient ewe flock. And so we need to be really careful with feed to gain. And we need to make sure we keep mature frame size in check so that we don't end up with big framey, hard doing animals. We want animals that grow very efficiently and then maintain themselves very efficiently when they get to maturity. And so that brings us to the final metric, residual feed intake, or RFI. And this is the difference between what they actually ate and what they're expected to eat. So we're able to predict what that intake is and then look at who ate less than expected. It is independent of average daily gain. So the cool thing about RFI is we can select for animals that eat less than expected based on their body size, their level of performance. And yet at the same time, we can select for animals that grow as quickly or as moderately as we want them to. Those two traits are independent and allows for us to select for each trait on its own without one trait influencing the other one. But the challenge becomes how good are we at predicting intake? And if we don't do a very good job predicting what that expected intake is, then how can we determine that difference between actual and expected intake? So we need to do a good job predicting expected intake. That's really critical to accurate RFI values. And so that RFI, as mentioned, it's based on that expected intake, and that's predicted using the metabolic body weight, as well as the average daily gain. So how big are they? What's their body size? Essentially how much body weight does that animal have to sustain? How, cellular mass that it has to keep functioning every day, relative to, how fast it's growing. We can predict what that expected intake is, and then we take the actual intake what minus what we expected them to eat, and that's the RFI number. So let's just say, based on an animal's size and their average daily gain, we would predict that they would eat 4 pounds a day. But in reality, they only eat 3.5 pounds per day. So they ate 3.5 pounds. We thought they were going to eat 4 pounds. So they actually ate a ½ pound less per day than what would be expected. So their RFI would be negative 0.5. On the contrary, if that animal ate 4.5 pounds when we thought they'd only eat 4 pounds, they ate a ½ pound more than expected. And so their RFI would be positive 0.5. So just like fecal egg counts, we want low negative values. Negative values are a good thing. They mean that animal ate less than expected based on their body size and their growth performance. This graphic was put together by Vitelli. So it's the company that has the feed intake infrastructure that we utilize. And I think this really, I know it's cattle images here, but it really depicts what these different metrics represent. And so on the left there, you see RFI. So that's assuming that we have animals that it puts everyone on the same playing field in terms of growth performance. So let's just say those animals gain the same amount, average daily gain is the same, who ate less while performing at the same level. And so in that way, we can keep mature size in check. We're not indirectly selecting for large mature sizes. We can reduce feed intake relative to a certain level of performance that we want our flock to have. Residual average daily gains, that's a new trait that I didn't mention before. This is a trait that's utilized in the cattle industry quite a bit. Residual average daily gain is when we hold feed intake constant. We put feed intake on put animals on the same playing field in terms of feed intake, and we say who gained faster with the same level of intake. So who gained more weight with the same level of intake. The problem with residual average daily gain is the same problem that we talked about with feed to gain ratio. Ultimately, we're selecting animals that grow faster, and we select animals that grow faster. We select ultimately larger, mature body sizes and potentially larger framed animals that are going to require more to sustain themselves. So that could be a potential problem. And then the last one there, FCR, that's feed conversion ratio, same thing as feed to gain. And so it's really the ratio of how much they ate to how much they gained. And the thing to remember here is we could have animals that eat a lot, but also grow really fast. We could also have animals that eat very little and then grow very little. Their feed conversion ratio is the exact same. They could have a 3-to-1 feed conversion ratio and be gaining like crazy or not gaining anything at all. And it's really just the ratio of those two. So unless we really understand what each one of those metrics, that is contributing to that, what they are, we don't really, it's hard to truly understand what those animals are doing with feed conversion alone. And ultimately, if we select animals that just grow faster, that may not be a good thing either. So there's a lot of different metrics out there. I'll make the case that RFI is probably the best metric that we should be using. But certainly there's arguments for some of these other metrics as well. It really depends. What's the end goal? What are you selecting towards? Are you trying to make animals that grow really fast in a feed yard, or are you trying to make low input sustainable use in a grazing system? And what the ultimate outcome is going to be for selection of these different traits that all represent feed efficiency and in just slightly different ways. So just a quick cattle example to depict this residual average daily gain trait. So in the Angus business, they have an EPD for residual average daily gain already, something we do not have in the sheep industry at this point. And it's going to predict progeny genetic merit for post-weaning gain, given a constant amount of feed consumed. And it's expressed in pounds per day, just, it's expressed as an average daily gain trait. So the current range for residual average daily gain is 0 to 0.41 pounds per day. And so as just a quick example here, if we had a 60-day feeding period post-weaning, we had a group of steers, their residual average daily gain EPD was 0.41, or they were sired by bulls, I should say, with a residual average daily gain EPD of 0.41, compared to a bull at 0. The steer sired by that bull with an R80G EPD of 0.41 would weigh on average 24.6 pounds more after a 60-day feeding period than those steers sired by with the bull with the R80G EPD of 0. If we relate that to economic value, if you say market price for 700-pound steers is about 2.25 right now, cattle are worth a pile of money. As some of you may be aware, it's a good time to be in the cattle business if you own cattle. It's not a good time to be buying cattle. Those high residual average yearly gain selected steers would be worth, north of $50 more per head, and they would have the exact same feed inputs. So we fed those two groups of steers exactly the same thing. And because the one was sired by bulls with that higher residual average yearly gain EPD, they're worth over $50 more. And feed inputs would be the same. So there's a lot of potential here, whether it be RADG or residual feed intake. There's certainly substantial economic benefits to improvements in feed efficiency. So what do we know in the cattle industry so far? Heritability estimates. What is that genetic component for these different traits? And how might they differ between heifers, that growing animal, versus cows? Dry matter intake, very highly heritable in heifers, 0.84. So a lot of what determines how much a heifer eats every day is genetic. In cows, it's about 0.5, so it's still a highly heritable trait in cows. Residual feed intake, it's 0.25, so about the same as our growth traits, a moderately heritable trait. In cows, it's slightly lower, 0.16, and then residual average yearly gain would be about the same heritability values as residual feed intake. So there is a genetic component to all of these traits in both heifers and cows. And really the next question is there a relationship between the genetics and the genes that control efficiency in heifers and the genes that control efficiency in those same animals when they reach maturity and become cows in the herd? And so the genetic correlation for dry matter intake between heifers and cows is, again, 0.84. So very high genetic correlation between heifers and cows for dry matter intake. So if they eat less as heifers, they're going to eat less. They're probably going to eat less as cows. If they eat more as heifers, they're probably going to eat more as cows. The genetic correlation for RFI between heifers and cows is still favorable, 0.41. So those heifers that tend to have lower RFI values as heifers will, when they're cows, may also have lower RFI values. And the genetic correlation for residual average yearly gain between heifers and cows is 0.31. So long story short, they're favorable, and it means that we can select for animals that are more feed efficient as growing animals, that heifer stage, and we can end up with cows that are also more efficient. We also know that there are biological differences that take place and changes that occur when we select animals for improved feed efficiency. It's not just magic happening. There's actually differences in protein metabolism and transport of those nutrients in those animals that are more feed efficient. Another study that is came out of the Western Range kind of region of the country. They looked at measuring heifers for measuring feed efficiency, RFI, in heifers as those growing calves. And then they took those same heifers, and when they entered production as pregnant 2-year-olds, they turned them out on rangeland and monitored weights and body condition scores as they're out there grazing in a relatively challenging, low input type environment. And so this just shows the nutrient composition there of the rangeland, and it's well below what would be considered nutrient requirements for that stage of animal. And then if we look at body condition score changes within those low or high RFI groups, you can see that those heifers that were classified as low RFI during their growing stage of development lost less body condition than the heifers that were classified as high RFI. And there's a lot less variability in the lows too. The heifers that were classified as high RFI as inefficient, they lost more body condition, and there's a lot of variability around how much weight they lost. And so pretty interesting there, and makes me think, especially with some of the droughts that we've been going through here earlier this summer and things like that, can we select sheep that are more feed efficient, have better RFI values? And when we get in those drought type environments, will those ewes sustain themselves better in those tough and challenging conditions? We're working on that. That's yet to be determined, but some of the cattle data gives me optimism that it's something we should explore. So what has been done in sheep so far? There has been some work at US Mark in this field. They did a relatively long study from 1986 to 1997, looking at a bunch of terminal sired lambs, measuring intake on them. So over 1,200 sheep in this study. And so Looking at the heritability in all of those animals, again, favorable. There's a moderate genetic component to feed efficiency in sheep, regardless of what trait you want to measure or consider. And then if we look at the genetic correlations between traits, the interesting thing here, you look at RFI compared to average daily gain, no relationship, no genetic correlation, which means we can select for those two traits independently. Where if you look at dry feed intake compared to average daily gain, very, very high correlation. And so if we just select for animals that eat less, they're probably going to grow less. If we select for animals that eat a bunch, they're going to grow a bunch, but they're also going to be eating a bunch in the process. So what would be ideal is to be able to select for those two traits independently and allow the producer to make their own decision on how much selection pressure they want to put on each individual component there. And so we need to select for them independently. Otherwise, indirect selection for potential indirect selection for growth will result in very large mature body weights and significant feed requirements for those larger animals. So we need to have two independent traits, and that's why residual feed intake becomes a very appealing metric to utilize as a measure of feed efficiency. So let's just walk through a quick example here to give you some context on the potential impact of these different metrics and what it looks like in reality. So we've been feeding sheep on these intake systems for a few years now. So I just pulled out two lambs to use as an example, and then I'll show you some larger data sets from what we've been doing. So these two ewe lambs, average weight on the course of the study, one was 76.6, one was 77.2, only 0.6 pounds different. Average daily gain was exactly the same. So over the course of the study, the feeding trial, they gained the exact same amount, and they pretty much weighed the same. So the expected intake would be the same, right? They grew the same at the same rate, and they weighed the same amount, so their expected intake would be the same. And so knowing that expected intake is the same, what did they actually eat? If we look at actual intake, lamb A consumed 3.37 pounds per day. Lamb B consumed 4.43 pounds per day. So while they weighed the same amount and they gained at the same rate, and their expected intake should be the same, we have animals that are eating a pound less of feed and doing the exact same thing. That's pretty intriguing. So if we look at feed to gain ratio, lamb A would be at 4.32 pounds of feed per pound of gain. Lamb B would be at 5.63 pounds of feed per pound of gain. So 1.4 pound difference in feed conversion ratio. And RFI, the lamb on the left, lamb A would be at a negative 0.83 compared to lamb B at a 0.23. So a pound difference there in terms of RFI. So what impact does this have? We look at that cost of gain. So how many dollars does it take for every pound that animal gains? Lamb A is at 0.97 dollars, 97 cents per pound of gain. Lamb B is at 1.28 dollars per pound of gain. So for every pound those two lambs gain, by feeding lamb A instead of lamb B, you're saving yourself 31 cents, assuming that feed costs about $450 a ton. And so if you do this, let's just say you grow out some lambs from 45 pounds to 80 pounds, kind of weaning weights, up to maybe ethnic slaughter weights. If you were feeding sheep like lamb B, it would cost you an additional, about $11 per head compared to feeding lambs similar to A. So you're saving yourself a significant amount of money per animal by identifying those that convert better, that save you in terms of cost of gain. And then if we look at RFI, that difference in RFI, and we relate that back to a feed value, we're saving ourselves about a quarter per day in terms of actual intake relative to expected intake. So if you have a group of lambs similar to A, they're going to save you, about a quarter every single day because they're going to eat less than expected, given their body size and level of performance. So long story short, again, there are significant economic benefits to be had by selection and identifying animals that are more feed efficient. But how do we actually go about doing that? And what's the potential to do that, especially, where we're at in the sheep industry right now, where we don't have an EBV for this trait. So we first have to start measuring it. Ultimately, if there's a trait we're interested in, we got to start measuring it and understanding the variation in that trait within the population, so that we can determine, is selection possible, and what kind of progress can be made. And so we were fortunate that one of our research stations, and actually our Cattlemen's Association, contributed a significant amount of money to get a GrowSafe system, a VitaliSense system, formerly known as GrowSafe, installed at one of our research stations. This system is very expensive, and we're very fortunate that some cattle money paid for the system, and then we got to benefit from it. So I get to feed sheep in between cattle studies, which is awesome. We have 8 feeders. And we can feed somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 to 160 lambs per trial. And these are 45 to 60-day feeding periods. And you can see here it's a modified feeder. Normally, with cattle in there, you take that insert out and put silage in there. Obviously, we're not going to feed lambs that way. So we build an insert there, use a red cane feeder, where we can fill that with a pelleted complete feed. The lambs then stick their head through that feed bunk. It registers their ID through their ear tag, and monitors how much feed they consume at every feeding event. You can notice on the bottom image there is a stair system that we build so those lambs can get up and eat out of that bunk, because it'd be too tall for the lamb to stand on the ground and be able to eat. So we have made a few modifications. We're also fortunate that our Department of Ag has seen the benefits and the potential with feed intake measuring technology. And so we're getting an additional 8 feeders at our Upper Mountain Research Station, which will also be retrofitted for sheep. So we will have that will also be able to feed 120 to 160 heads. So we're looking at one time, feeding across both stations. We could feed in the well north of 200, 240 plus lambs at one time, between the 2 stations. And then you think about how many rotations we can get throughout a given calendar year. And there's a lot of potential out there to feed a lot of sheep moving into the future. And so pretty excited about the potential that we have to start quantifying this trait. So what have we done thus far? And so this just shows our different contemporary groups, our different management groups. We do have 2 lambing groups. We lamb a group of sheep in February and March, and we lamb another group in September and the first part of October. We then take those lambs that are raised on grass until weaning. And then at weaning, we transition them on to feed, and then move them into this system where we feed them for 45 to 60 days. And monitor individual intake, and then those lambs go back out to pasture. And so I have listed here the number of sheep that we have, that we've had in each group. And I will be the first one to admit that we do not have enough sheep. We certainly need more. We are actively trying to grow our flock and incorporate more animals and get more animals through this system. And numbers and population size is certainly a concern with this, where we're at currently. So I'll show you what we have, kind of take it with a grain of salt, because it is a relatively small sample size. But I think the trends are encouraging, and I'm hoping that through more years of work and a larger flock size, we might be able to better understand this trait and maybe get some tools available to utilize. All the lambs are fed a 16% complete pellet, so everything they need in their diet is in that pellet. It's got a coccidiostat, it's got ammonium chloride, vitamin mineral pack, and so that they're not getting any additional feed in their diet. There's no hay, there's no supplemental mineral, anything like that. 100% of what they consume every day is coming out of that bunk, and we are weighing every pound that animal eats automatically as that animal sticks its head in the feeder and eats. So it's pretty interesting, pretty cool technology. It results in very large data sets. You think about how many times an animal eats in a given day and visits the feeder in a given day, and we are quantifying at every single feeding event how much did they eat. And then that is all getting assimilated and put together, and we're determining daily intakes, and then comparing that to how fast those animals are growing, what those body sizes are. So to show you some variation in terms of daily intake, this is our ewe lambs here. And so we've seen this is, again, across 4 different contemporary groups, a couple years worth of doing this. Range is anywhere from 2.23 to 5.36 with an average about 3.75 pound per day on the females. On the ram lamb intakes, slightly more, 2.71 to 5.89, with an average about 4.2. So the ram lambs on average are eating about a half pound more per day, which would be expected. Feed conversion ratio. So this is an adjusted feed to gain ratio. It's adjusted based on the Beef Improvement Federation guidelines, based on the ratio between metabolic body size of the contemporary group and the individual. So it's just a more fair assessment of feed conversion ratio. The range here on the females is 3.26 to 9.15, with an average of just over 5 pounds of feed per pound of gain in our females. And in the ram lambs, that range is 2.85 to 6.9 with an average of about 4.7. So just in terms of raw feed conversion ratio, the ram lambs do convert a little better than the females, as expected, about a half pound better, half pound less feed per pound of gain in our males compared to our females, which is expected. And we've seen that there's lots of data to support that across species throughout time. So all kind of expected things here. That I think some intriguing and exciting things to note is just the variation that exists. Especially in terms of like these feed conversion ratios. You know, if you can identify animals that are converting 3 to 1 compared to animals that are converting north of 6 to 1, you're cutting your feed bill in half by feeding a group of those lower end animals that are converting less or eating less per pound of gain. So there's significant variation here, which is from a selection standpoint, provides a lot of optimism and opportunity for improvement over time. And then if we look at RFI, again, we see a lot of variation. So all of these graphs are based on, I sorted this population based on RFI. So all the past 2 slides that you saw, those graphs, the animals are all ordered in the same order. Now we get to RFI and we compare actual intake to expected intake. And you see this nice distribution here where you have a lot of animals, again, around average, and then you have some animals that are out towards the extremes. Animals that, on the female side of things, ate a pound less than expected, up to, over 1.5 pounds more than expected. The average for residual feed intake will always be 0 within a contemporary group. Residual feed intake on the males ranges negative 1.4 up to 1.2. So again, it's a selectable range. There's opportunities to identify animals at the extremes and breed to those animals and observe and see if that is passed on to the next generation. So I just pulled out of one of those contemporary groups, our summer 22 contemporary group. I just pulled a subset out there and I identified the 10 lowest RFI lambs and the 10 highest RFI lambs. So the 2 extremes selected based on RFI and then looked at actual intake over the entire test period. And you'll see that almost every day that they're on test, those animals that are identified as low RFI actually consume less compared to the high RFI animals. So by selecting for low RFI, identifying low RFI animals, you are finding those animals that are actually eating less every day. And then if we look at weight gain between those 2 groups, it's virtually the same. They're gaining pretty much exactly the same, and they're eating less every single day. So it has a very positive benefit, benefits to feed conversion and lower input costs. So have some scatter plots here that show the relationships between some of these different feed efficiency traits that I discussed in the first part of the presentation. So here we have residual feed intake compared to daily intake. R squared is 0.35. And so kind of a moderate relationship here. And in general, as daily feed intake increases, residual feed intake is going to increase as well, kind of expected. And I just showed you that selection for low RFI is going to result in animals that generally eat less. So that kind of makes sense. Residual feed intake compared to adjusted feed to gain ratio, again, a positive relationship. As feed to gain ratio increases and those animals become less efficient, residual feed intake is also going to increase, indicating those animals are less efficient. So all of this makes sense. This is where it gets really interesting. If we look at residual feed intake compared to average daily gain, you see the R squared is essentially 0. It's pretty much as close as you can get to zero without being zero. Very small number, which means there's essentially no relationship between residual feed intake and average daily gain, which means I can find animals that grow extremely fast, and I can find animals that grow relatively slow that have the exact same residual feed intake. It allows me to select those two traits independently, and I can identify animals that grow and fit into a production system that I desire and have a relatively low residual feed intake at the same time. So I can make them grow really fast and have a low residual feed intake. I can make them grow at a more moderate pace and have more of a moderate, mature size and also have a low RFI. So I can do both. And it gives me a lot more power as a producer. And as someone that's breeding and selecting livestock, to select those animals that fit the specific scenario. And then this is where we run into problems. So there's a relatively strong relationship, or stronger, I shouldn't say strong relationship, a stronger relationship compared to some of these other comparisons between feed to gain ratio and average daily gain. And it's negative here. And you'll see that as average daily gain increases, feed to gain ratio decreases. So if we are selecting animals based on feed to gain ratio and identifying those animals that have low feed to gain ratios, that means they convert better. In doing so, we will also identify the animals that are simply growing faster, which may be beneficial to us. I mean, in certain production systems, that may be exactly what you want. If you're running a feed yard, if you're putting animals on feed post weaning and you want them to convert as efficiently as possible, and you're feeding them and then moving them straight out of a feed yard into a slaughter market, that could be exactly what you're after. If your goal is to select replacement females and you're throwing those sheep back out on grass and you want them to be pretty moderate in their mature size, maybe that's not the best trait to utilize for your selection program. So it really depends ultimately what your long-term goals are. So can we select for improved feed efficiency in sheep? What does this look like, and what have we observed thus far? I've shown you that there's variation and there's range within the population. What happens when we start selecting animals that are on either extreme? And so I'll just walk you through these different contemporary groups. I have them broken out by ewe lambs and ram lambs, and then by sire that we have utilized, and point out some of the selection decisions that we've made. All of our selection decisions have been based on RFI. We have not used, intake, average daily gain, or feed conversion ratio in those selection decisions. And so here in the first year, after the first year of the study, we identified these differences between sire 3 and sire 4. Those were the sires that were kind of, at either extreme for either high RFI or low RFI. Sire 3 would be our high inefficient sire group, and the sire 4 would be our low RFI, more efficient sire group. So these lambs were fed over the summer of 2022. We identified those two sire groups. And so it was kind of, sometimes luck works in your favor. So while these animals were actually on the feeding trial, all of our fall lambing ewes were in gestation. We had bred those ewes in April. They were due to lamb in September. This feeding trial took place during June and July, and these two sire group differences were identified in the first part of August. I was like, oh, sire 3 and sire 4, that's pretty interesting. And then it occurred to me that out of sheer luck, we had bred our entire fall lambing flock to sire 3 and sire 4. So this could not have worked out better. And we didn't have to wait 5 months for ewes to gestate. We were going to have another lamb crop be born within a month that were out of the two sire groups that were of peak interest to me in terms of being extreme for RFI. And so we look at that winter contemporary group, and you'll see over the next couple slides, we had some sex ratio kind of imbalances. And so some of the sire groups had very few animals in a particular sex. If animals had a very small contemporary group within sex, I did not report and did not show their feed efficiency numbers. I didn't think it was fair to report those numbers with a very small contemporary group size. And so here, again, on the ewe lamb side of things, sire 3 didn't have very many ewe lambs, unfortunately, so I chose it best to not report those. But sire 4, you'll see it's a positive RFI here within the ewe lamb group. But kind of skip over the ewe lambs there for a second. focus on the ram lambs where we have that direct comparison between sire 3 and sire 4. And you'll see that those lambs, the ram lambs sired by sire 3, had higher RFI values compared to the ram lambs sired by sire 4. So the trend is the same, right? If we look at our sire 3 and sire 4 groups within the summer 2022 group and the winter 2023 group, the trends are the same. The sire 4 lambs tend to have lower RFI values compared to the sire 3 lambs. So that's pretty interesting. So then we took a son of sire 3 and a son of sire 4, because I wanted to know, can we select a son of each one of these rams, and can we get the same results? Can this be passed generation to generation? And so this is looking at the following summer's lamb crop in that contemporary group. So we used a son of sire 3 and a son of sire 4. Sure enough, those lambs sired by that son of sire 4 once again had lower RFI values compared to the son of sire 3. Again, not a huge contemporary group, but the trends are intriguing. And you'll see on the ram lamb side of things, we didn't have enough ram lambs out of sire 6, but at the sire 7, those ram lambs did have a negative RFI value, which would be favorable. You look at the winter 2024 group, and here I've highlighted, we did use a couple different rams. I wanted to compare sire 4 directly with one of his sons in the same contemporary group. So we used sire 4 and we used the son of sire 4. And then this sire 10 was a new ram we got that we utilized in that summer 2023 group, as well as the winter 2024 group. And so if we look at here, comparing kind of that sire 4 selection line along with the sire 10 lambs, in general, the sire 10 progeny have higher RFI values across contemporary groups compared to those sire 4 individuals, whether they be sire 4 himself or sons of sire 4. So again, across contemporary groups, we're seeing some trends, consistent trends between these different sire groups, which gives me some optimism that maybe we can make some progress over time and be able to actually select for this trait. So then I went through and I was trying to figure out how's the best way to present these data and kind of make it easy to understand and straightforward. And so I decided to group each sire group, the progeny of each sire, by RFI classification. So were they less than 0? Were they negative for RFI? Or were they greater than 0? Were they positive for RFI and less efficient? And so this graph simply shows the proportion of a sire's progeny that classify as low RFI. So what percentage of the lambs that they have produced thus far for us end up in that negative RFI category, in that negative RFI ranking. So if we look at the 50th percentile there, so those rams that would those sire groups that are less than 50%, that means less than half of their progeny are ending up as low RFI, which means the majority of their progeny are high RFI or inefficient animals, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum on the right side of the graph there, where like sire 7, for example, who's a son of sire 4, 80% of his progeny have ended up in the low RFI, negative RFI category as more efficient animals. So the interesting thing is you kind of look across here, sire 1 and sire 8, who is a son of sire 1, they're both less than half of their progeny end up low RFI. So the majority of those sire groups, the majority of the progeny out of those sire groups end up as positive RFI, less efficient animals. Where if you look at sire 4, he's kind of the unique one. Sire 4, as well as the 2 sons of sire 4 that we've utilized, end up with 2/3 or more of their progeny have classified in that low RFI, more efficient category. So that's encouraging, and that's pretty interesting. And we'll continue to build this data set and update these numbers as time goes on. And so the sire stuff was interesting to me, but I also had seen some cattle data and research that had been done and some interest on the maternal side. We know that mitochondria is passed through maternal lines. An individual gets 100% of its mitochondrial DNA comes from mom. And so we're passing mitochondria directly through that maternal line. We know that mitochondria they're the powerhouse of the cell. They're producing energy. And so it makes a lot of sense that, maybe mitochondria play into this feed efficiency thing. If we have animals converting better and doing more with less, it would make sense that mitochondria are playing a part in that, being that that is the organelle that produces energy. And so wanted to look at this maternal effect and started digging through pedigrees, because the sire stuff is easy because you have these sire groups. Sires have, multiple offspring, many offspring in a given contemporary group. Relatively straightforward to sort through these different sire groups. You get on the maternal side of things, and all of a sudden a ewe might only have, one or two lambs in a contemporary group in her entire lifetime. What a ram will produce in 1 year is what a ewe might produce in her entire lifetime. And so it becomes a lot more challenging to develop contemporary groups and essentially treatment groups that are large enough to be able to run statistics on and to be able to really analyze. So it gets a lot more challenging. And so started digging through pedigrees, and I was looking at, those animals that were very efficient, and who's in their pedigree on the maternal side, and are they related? Are they not related? And I kept coming back to this 5008 ewe. This ewe is an older ewe. It's a ewe that we bought in a few years ago and have been using, and has been very productive in our flock. She has 13 total lambs at this point. She's currently pregnant and due in September with another set of lambs as she's 9 years old. And so been a very productive ewe for us. She in her 2021, her first lamb crop for us, she produced this ewe 21040. That 21040 ewe then went on in the spring of 2022, went on to produce ewe lamb tag number 22054, who, remember 2022, that was the first time we tested any sheep in our GrowSafe system. And so that was the first time we had the opportunity to collect feed intake data. And so that ewe lamb, her daughter, had what was ranked number 7 low RFI. So she was one of those more efficient animals, number 7 low RFI ewe lamb in that summer 22 contemporary group. In 2023, she had ram lamb 23050, who ended up tying ranked number 2 as the low RFI ram lamb in that summer 2023 group. So now we have a granddaughter, or grandson and granddaughter, out of 5008 that have both ranked in the low RFI category, and in the case of the ram lamb, done quite well and being one of the more elite individuals within that contemporary group. This 5008 ewe, we get back to her spring 2022 crop. She was the dam of ram lamb 22040, who ended up being the number 1 ranked low RFI ram lamb in the summer 2022 group. And then that ram went on. We used that ram in our breeding program. He went on to sire progeny in 2023. He sired the number 1 low RFI ewe lamb and the number 1 low RFI ram lamb. So we think about the impact there through that 5008 ewe, and pretty interesting there. We actually did a little bit of line breeding here. So we took that 22054 ewe, that would be a granddaughter of 5008, who was in the low RFI category, and we bred her back to 22040. So we bred her to a direct son of 5008. So now you have 5008 on both sides of the pedigree. And that 23027 ram lamb that was generated in 2023 that ranked the number 1 low RFI ram lamb happened to be both the son and the daughter of low RFI ranking individuals. And that line breeding and that additional selection pressure, maybe that contributed to it. In the fall 2022 lamb crop, so that 5008 ewe, she was in our spring program. We do, depending when weaning falls and when we turn ewes out with rams, we will try to move and expose some ewes in the spring group to lamb in the fall if we can. So she turned around, and after lambing in the spring, she turned around, rebred, and had twins in the fall. And she's been in our fall group ever since. That ewe, she had 2 ewe lambs, twin ewe lambs, and they were ranked number 2 and number 4 as low RFI ewe lambs in that winter 2023 contemporary group. So again, kind of interesting here. And I started following all these pedigrees back, and it's just like 5008 kept showing up every single time. And I'm like, maybe there's something to this. And so pretty interesting, and continuing to dig into this and trying to understand what those potential maternal impacts could be on feed efficiency. But it seems like this maternal line is relatively consistent. So all this said, how do we get these data in your hands? I could talk about all this all day long and get as excited as I do about it. But ultimately, if it's not available to you all as producers out there in the industry, how valuable is it, and how big of an impact will this actually make? And so what does this look like? And these are, I'm going to throw out a few ideas here. These are by no means like being implemented today or tomorrow. There are things that I think us as an organization, as EAPK, as Katahdin producers, as an industry, I think we need to sit down and have these discussions and think about what's going to work, what's the best way to do this, how do we achieve everyone's goals and improve the breed as a whole. So custom testing would be one option. We have this system. It's a system that's far too expensive for most individual producers to own. I want that system to be full as much of the year as possible. I hate that system sitting empty for even a couple days. Could we test contemporary groups for producers? Could you bring in a group of animals, we test them and then send them home at the end of that feeding trial? Maybe that's an option. Could we do some RAM testing? And we're all probably familiar with the RAM testing system and that model, where you bring in potential stud rams, evaluate them for a period of time, and then send them home, and hopefully select those that are, have those more favorable feed efficiency metrics. Can we do some progeny testing? I think this progeny testing has a lot more, in my opinion, has a lot more value than RAM testing, because progeny testing allows you to evaluate an entire progeny contemporary group rather than just one individual. So now instead of just getting data on one individual ram lamb, we're getting data on 15, 20 progeny out of a given ram. That average across 15 or 20 progeny is a far more accurate representation of that animal's genetic merit than one individual metric alone. And so in this case, it gets a little bit tricky because you have to have that ewe flock to kind of be that base ewe flock to utilize for the random matings. And we could bring in producer rams. There's also, the AI in the sheep industry is heavily utilized in the show industry. In the production industry has not been adopted and utilized as much, but maybe there's an opportunity there where we could get some semen on influential rams throughout the breed. We could randomly breed those individuals to our ewes. We could raise all of those individuals, those progeny in the same contemporary group in the exact same environment, put them through our grow safe system, get it feed intake data. And now instead of having feed efficiency data on one ram lamb, you have feed efficiency data on an entire progeny group out of a sire, and be able to compare those different progeny groups. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and that's one that is of particular interest to me. And then seed stock sales, and this is kind of where we're at right now. I would like to move beyond this and provide more resources to you all as producers. We're testing our sheep. We do, have a production sale. We sell some sheep throughout the year, and those sheep have feed efficiency data. They're, it's an individual animal here and there. Hopefully those animals can pass on some of those traits, but again, we don't have an EBV. So ultimately they're phenotypic data points. And we know they're phenotypes that are influenced by environment. We're doing the best job we can to maintain contemporary group structure, but they are what they are, and you kind of got to take them with a grain of salt. So we're trying to get some sheep out there with some favorable feed efficiency metrics. But that's only going to go so far. And I would much prefer to evaluate some of your genetics and then be able to get those genetics back in your hands than just try to do it internally. Because we're going to get a lot farther if we go at this together. And so just some ideas there and some things to ponder. And ultimately, the long-term goal of all this work is to answer the question that, can we evaluate sheep in this feed intake system, this Vitelli Sense or Grow Safe system? Can we evaluate feed intake at that growing stage of life? And are those animals more efficient when we throw them out on grass and make them work in a grazing system? And so with that, I will answer any questions you guys have, and we can open it up for discussion.
Awesome. Did everybody follow everything that he was talking about? Might have to go back and watch the recording. So we'll take any questions now. Appreciate Andrew hopping on here. It sounds like there's a lot of really cool stuff going on down at NC State and a lot of potential opportunity for producers to get involved. questions?
I have a couple questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. This last slide was the one that got me thinking throughout the whole thing is, can you extrapolate what you're doing in a feedlot for producers that are pasture-based, the feed efficiency part of it? And then being a nurse, another question I had, thinking about this in a human way, is that I'm thinking that the ones with the lower RFI may be the ones with lower metabolism. And if, because they're gaining weight without doing anything, burning calories. So I wonder, like if they're out there on the field, how that would change the RFI. And if you're using ewe lambs, are you seeing any lowered prolificacy in these lower RFI ewes? Because in humans, low metabolism usually messes up cycles.
Yes, that's a great point you bring up and some good things to ponder. I don't have a great answer for you. So our goal, all these females that are in our flock, we're trying to grow as fast as we can. So pretty much we sell a few ewe lambs every year, but by and large, we keep the vast majority of our females. So they're all going through the system and then they're growing out on grass and expected to be used. And so we're monitoring weights and body condition scores at breeding and then at weaning with the goal of, it's going to take a little while because we need more animals. But the goal is to kind of quantify how well do those animals sustain themselves on grass relative to litter sizes and litter weights. And hopefully, as we go, a few years down the road here, we'll have a data set that we can share to show the differences between these high and low selection groups and how well they sustain themselves in a forage-based system. So I wish I had an answer for you today. I don't. More to come on that. In terms of prolificacy related to RFI status, I'm not sure of any data to support that one way or another. I mean, the only anecdotal thing I'll maybe mention is that ewe line that I showed all those low RFI animals stemming from. That is probably one of the highest prolificacy, highest maternal indexing ewes in our flock. And so is it just a fluke? There's a very good chance that's just a fluke. We'll see as time goes on. That's purely anecdotal and one individual to use as an example. So that's a great point you bring up, and certainly something we'll pay attention to as we go forward here.
Thank you.
Andrew, do you think that you can extrapolate based on your feed efficiency studies thus far, mostly predominantly that have been done on younger animals, those under a year old, on feed efficiency and the ability for ewe lambs that have lambs, so ewe lambs that have lambed at 12 to 14 months, and their ability to get back in condition to lamb as yearlings again?
Yeah, that's a great question. I need to go look at that. I have some real preliminary data on a really small data set, looking at at weaning in that first production cycle. So they're in the grow safe system. We'll just use our spring lambing group from June to July. They go back on grass in August, and we put them in breeding groups in September. And then we'll lamb out those ewe lambs at 12 months. And very small data set. There's some small body condition differences, maybe in favor of the low RFI individuals, with relatively similar litter weights. Again, that's a really small data set, so take it for what it's worth. I personally don't have a lot of confidence in that yet, but again, it's a trend that is encouraging to keep track of. So that is a great point you bring up, and I need to go back now that we have. We really have two groups. We have the summer 2023, 2022, 23. We're about to have 24. Those ewe lambs, we're starting to get the very first ewe lambs to go through the system are just now 2 years old. And so we're starting to get animals that have been in production for a couple years after going through the system. And that's a great point you bring up. And I'll definitely go back and look at those differences between weaning and breeding and how those individuals flushed back up relative to their RFI status.
Yeah, because that would be really interesting. I mean, you did a great job of explaining kind of the cost benefits and the dollar that can equate when you're in a more feed efficient animal. On the breeding side of it, again, if you've got 2 years worth of feed going into your ewe lambs and then your yearling lambs to breed in 2 cycles in that time period, you've got quite a bit of money in feed and growing that animal. And again, is there a way to save money by selecting for a feed efficiency trait that allows for that ewe lamb to come back into good condition and be ready to breed that second time?
Right. I'm really glad you brought that up. That's a great point. And I'll dig into that and let you know what I find.
Great. Thank you.
We got another question in the chat here from Lee Holcomb. Can we learn anything from what the beef industry has done that we should avoid?
Yeah, so there's some evidence out there. I think RFI and these feed efficiency traits, they're like any other trait. Optimization is probably better than maximizing. And I've heard some reports in the cattle world, if you select heifers for super low RFI and single trait them for low RFI, you may end up with some small, less productive animals, which may not be potentially the right thing for a marketing or a production system. So it's like anything. It's you got to find that happy medium, and it's a tool in the toolbox that should be considered, but also, what's the sufficient level to work in your system relative to, maybe the extreme isn't what we want. Maybe it's somewhere in between. And that somewhere in between is going to be different for all of us. And so I think there are some things to pay attention to. I think the push, I have some concerns for the push, especially like in Angus, for residual average daily gain. And you'll sit in groups that are discussing feed efficiency, and they will argue all day long whether we should use RFI or residual average daily gain. And ultimately, I guess the board of directors in Angus determined that RADG was going to be the trait they go after. I have some concerns with that, as I expressed earlier, in terms of you're ultimately selecting for an average daily gain trait. Angus cattle used to be this very moderate maternal breed, and now they're like the #1 breed for carcass attributes and probably one of the most terminal breeds. And so we've taken a breed of cattle that was really good at something that, a lot of Katahdins are kind of known for. And just through a push for terminal traits and growth, Angus cows are some of the biggest cows in the country. I hope that we're not saying that about Katahdin sheep in 15 years. But I think things like that are also important things to pay attention to. And what as we develop this data set and as we start utilizing these metrics, the traits that we use and how we use them will dictate, long-term changes. And observing what's happening in the cattle industry from that regard is probably something we need to pay attention to.
Any other questions? If not, just want to thank Dr. Weaver again for hopping on here and sharing some research update and doing a really nice job with a very in-depth, complicated topic. So look forward to seeing everybody next month on our webinar, the 4th Wednesday of the month, and enjoy the rest of